in terms of Leibniz's rhetorical strategy. On Lamara's view, Leibniz seeks to avoid sterile controversy by hiding from his readers views that he's afraid may shock and alienate them, and by slowly leading them to his views by paths that they can take without straining credulity. And so Lamara notes, there's an esoteric and an exoteric Leibniz. And this is a theme that has been discussed in this conference a bit. As an exoteric work meant for the larger public, Leibniz doesn't want to reveal too much in the Essai de Theodicy that will shock his readers. Now, while Don doesn't address this question directly, in the course of his discussion, he too refers to the distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric. Both Lamara and Don cite a very revealing passage Leibniz wrote at the end of an exposition that Leibniz wrote for Ramond of the system of monads. After Ramond makes that comment, Leibniz drafts out a letter to Ramond discussing his theory of monads. And at the end, it's a very interesting text that represents perhaps what you might think of as the first sketch of what ultimately becomes Principles of Nature of Grace and the Monadology. And at the end of that sketch, Leibniz writes, "But I fear that this letter is so full of abstract thoughts, far removed from what is commonly imagined, may repel you. I want you to note, however, how I value and honor you in writing to you, what I would not readily write to others. Thus, this letter must be only for you. Many others would find it absurd or unintelligible." But it's significant that in the end, he doesn't send it to Ramond, though one can debate why. Maybe he didn't trust Ramond. Maybe he didn't think that he had gotten it quite right yet. But still, this is a very interesting paragraph. Now, we're going to come back to the idea of a hidden Leibnizian doctrine in a little bit. It's certainly an issue relevant to the question at hand. But at the same time, I think that there's a simpler explanation for why the monadology is not in evidence in the Essai de Theodicy. It's simply not directly relevant to the questions that are centrally at issue in the Essai de Theodicy. It is simply not directly relevant to those questions. To make my case, I want to look back at the main themes of the Essai de Theodicy and take up again the question of the relation between the Theodicy and Leibniz's metaphysics. In the end, this will lead us to see Leibniz's supposed system in a different perspective and perhaps better appreciate the place of the monadology in his thought. Now, how does the monadology relate to the Theodicy project? For Don and for Lamara, they are very closely related, but are they? Earlier, I talked about how to understand the monadology project. As I understand it, it's the metaphysical view that the ultimate constituents of the world are non-extended simple substances, and that bodies are to be understood in terms of these metaphysically more basic entities. But what's the Theodicy project? In the opening sentence of his book, Don characterizes it as follows, quote, "The defense of God's justice as it is expressed in the creation of the best of all possible worlds." This suggests that there are two elements to the project, the solution to the problem of evil and the doctrine of the creation of the best of all possible worlds. Now, this is not at all an inaccurate account of the contents of the Essai de Theodicy. The text in question is something of a rambling work which meanders through a large number of topics, including stories and observations of all sorts thrown in for good measure, like a conversation with an amiable but not altogether focused raconteur. It's also an answer to Pierre Bayle, with whom Leibniz had been exchanging views for some years. But of course, the central question is the problem of evil. And this is what Leibniz writes at the beginning of part one of the essay, which follows on the preliminary discourse on the conformity of faith and reason. You have the text there, I'm not going to read it. But there are obviously after some preliminary considerations in part one, he then takes up successively the two difficulties that in part two and part three that he outlines in this paragraph. The problem, first difficulty about sin, which is moral evil, and then the second difficulty about physical evil, sorrows, sufferings, miseries, etc., in part three. Now, in order to address these questions, Leibniz appeals to a central thesis that God created the best of all possible worlds. But it seems to me we should separate this thesis, Leibniz's creation doctrine, from the questions that constitute the Theodicy proper. By the Theodicy proper, I understand the resolution of the problems of evil. The creation doctrine is indeed closely related to the Theodicy problem. It's the central tool that Leibniz uses to answer the theological questions at issue in the Essay de Theodicy. But the creation doctrine is much more general than the Theodicy proper, and it applies more widely in Leibniz's philosophy. In particular, it applies to Leibniz's metaphysics taken quite generally, whereas what lies behind the doctrines such as pre-established harmony, or even in his physics, where it lies behind principles such as the equality of cause and effect and the principle of continuity, from which the laws of nature are derived. And arguably, it lies behind the monadology proper, insofar as one can argue that in this best of all possible worlds, the ultimate constituents would have to be monads. If we understand Leibniz's theodicy broadly, as Don does, including both the resolution of the problem of evil and the doctrine of creation, with which Leibniz addresses the problem of evil, then indeed the monadology and Leibniz's metaphysics more generally are closely connected with the Theodicy project. But if we understand the Theodicy project more narrowly as addressing the problem of evil, then it isn't so clear what Leibniz's metaphysics or monadology are related to it. And if we understand the book, the Essay de Theodicy, as primarily concerned with addressing the Theodicy problem taken as the problem of evil, then it isn't such a mystery that the monadological metaphysics doesn't make much of an appearance in its pages. It just isn't really directly relevant. And Leibniz fully recognized that. In the preface to the Essay de Theodicy, Leibniz wrote, and I'll skim through this longer paragraph here, there are two famous labyrinths where our reason very often goes astray. One concerns the question of the free and the necessary. The other consists in the discussion of continuity and of the indivisibles. The first perplexes all the human race, the other exercises philosophers only. And the first is indeed what it is that he's focusing on in the Essay de Theodicy. And then he continues on, I shall have perchance at another time an opportunity to declare myself on the second and point out that, etc., etc. The labyrinth of the composition of the continuum is the labyrinth, the consideration of which gives rise to monads and the monadological metaphysics. What Leibniz is saying pretty clearly here at the very beginning of the Essay de Theodicy is that, interesting and important as it is, it's simply not what he's going to be talking about in the book. As he informs the reader, it's a topic for another occasion. That it appears at all in the Essay de Theodicy is simply a result of Leibniz's digressive style, the fact that he can't stop himself from telling a good story, or a story that he thinks is pretty interesting, or from informing his reader about his insights and accomplishments in other domains. But strictly speaking, the monadology just doesn't belong in the Essay de Theodicy. That isn't to say that they aren't in some significant ways connected. As I said earlier, both depend on the same basic doctrine of creation, as do a number of other domains in Leibniz's thought. But the monadology project proper and the Theodicy project proper are largely independent and can be pursued independently of one another. In a way, this answers the question that I raised at the beginning about why there's so little of the monadology in the essay du